Hello, class. Today we're going to discuss the Freudian solution to the paradox of horror. Here are some study guide questions to help us get started. 1. What is the Freudian solution to the paradox of horror? 2. What is a taboo in a Freudian sense? 3. Which role does taboo play in socialization, according to Freudians? 4. What does a horror monster do for socialized adults, according to Freudians? 5. Which type of monster do Freudians easily analyze? 6. Which types of monsters do Freudians have a tougher time with? 7. What is Carroll's combinatorial objection to the Freudian solution? 8. How should a Freudian respond to the combinatorial objection? Okay, as always, I'm going to be giving the answers to these questions throughout the video, and when I do so, you might want to pause the video itself so that you can write down the answers, type them up, crochet them into a sweater, hammer them into an ice sculpture, pour them out in gasoline in the street and light it, however it is that you compartmentalize the information. So, we're talking about Freudians. There's a lot to say about the work of Sigmund Freud, and we're not going to say any of it. Note that we're talking about Freudians. These are folks who have applied some of Freud's thought to certain philosophical puzzles. Carroll lists a few in his Philosophy of Horror, including John Mack, but there are others. Now, if you recall, the paradox of horror is an inconsistent triad. That is, it's a trio of assumptions, each of which seems pretty intuitive, but when you take them together, they imply a contradiction. Since they imply a contradiction, they can't all be true. The paradox is that audiences enjoy horror fiction for its distinctive genre-defining characteristic. That distinctive genre-defining characteristic is frightening and disgusting the audience. And finally, audiences don't like being frightened and disgusted. One of them has to go. Which one is the question? And the Freudian solution is a psychological solution that challenges Assumption 1. Assumption 1 says, audiences enjoy horror fiction for its distinctive genre-defining characteristic. And at first, that seems true enough. After all, there are many movies which are advertised just as horror movies. Sure, sometimes you might go and see a movie because it's directed by Jordan Peele, or maybe you'll go and see a movie because it has Morgan Freeman in it, or maybe you'll go and see a movie because it has Cillian Murphy, but sometimes you'll go and see a movie because it's a horror movie. That is, you go and see it because of its distinctive genre-defining characteristic. Or do you? Let's talk a little bit about taboos. In ordinary language, to say something is taboo is to say it's forbidden, and in some contexts it's sort of excitingly forbidden. But to Freudian psychologists, a taboo is a strong cultural forbiddance, which is so intense that even thinking of it is deemed shameful. Now, exactly how strongly forbidden something has to be in order to be a taboo, that's a good question, but we're not going to go into it here. The idea is that there are certain behaviors, certain practices, certain things, and certain, states of affairs which are so forbidden by a culture, so utterly forbidden, that it's shameful even to think of them. You should not even be thinking of these things. And if you're properly socialized, you'll shudder and flinch and have a disgusted response when you try to think of them. Standard examples of taboos include incest, cannibalism, contact with excrement, sadistic torture of the weak and innocent, things like that. It's an interesting debate about whether taboos are universal and under which circumstances these taboos may vary, but we're not going into those. We're just looking at how one interpretation of Freudian theory uses the idea of a taboo to try to solve this philosophical puzzle. Now, for someone to become acquainted with a phenomenon as taboo is for them to come to learn that it is so disgusting they shouldn't even be thinking of it. It's for them to come to learn that it's a big no, in other words. According to Freudians, when you are being socialized and during your upbringing as a child up through being an adult, you are made to consider certain things to be disgusting, absolutely disgusting. Physical engagement with them is often met with punishment, and we often teach children that certain things are gross by having gross reactions ourselves. If you've ever dealt with babies or young children, you know very well that babies just don't automatically know certain things are gross or disgusting. You do have to teach them that certain things are gross and disgusting. So, as a child is socialized, they come to learn that certain things are very, very bad and that they shouldn't even be thinking of them. Really gross. And yet, once a person becomes a socialized adult, they still have the idea of the thing. The idea of the thing has power, and there's something mysterious about it since it was never explored. Gross, yes. Averse you may be to it, yes. But it's also mysterious. And so, taboo plays a certain kind of role in socialization. It presents a certain selection of phenomenon as absolutely unapproachable and thoroughly forbidden to the point of being unthinkable, and thereby adds a little mystery to them. Just a little one. Remember, it's very important, according to the Freudian analysis, that it's not that anyone has a secret desire to engage with that taboo. That's not the case. If you're a socialized adult, you have no desire to engage with the taboo. You do not like the taboo. You don't want to do anything having to do with the taboo. Not really. And here's where the idea of a fictional monster comes in. Horror fiction is fiction which presents a monster. And according to Freudians, a monster is a representation of some cultural taboo, and it's presented in a way where it's the antagonist, it's disgusting, and so you can indulge in the curiosity of looking at it and thinking about it, but in a way where your adult socialized self is not violated. You don't think the monster is cool, you're not cheering for the monster, at least not in a serious, earnest way where you would emulate its misdeeds in real life. No, you get to have your cake and eat it too, according to the Freudians. You get to explore the taboo that the monster represents. You get to genuinely explore it, but you don't explore it in a way that's indulgent, that says to the audience and to you, yeah, you like this, don't you? You get to be the socialized adult who hates the taboo, and who also gets to explore it by witnessing its metaphorical representation as a monster. Does that make sense? Here, let's take some examples. One of the strongest cultural taboos is cannibalism, eating people. And so, unsurprisingly, this goes well for the Freudian account, there are monsters aplenty which either commit or represent cannibalism. You have your flesh-eating ghouls from Romero's Night of the Living Dead movies. You've got the backwoods cannibals from The Hills Have Eyes. You've got the cannibals from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre family. Let's take that one. According to Freudians, the cannibals from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre family represent cannibalism itself, and their display on the screen and the danger that they pose for the protagonists represents the taboo posing a danger to us. Now, we are socialized adults. We don't like the taboo. When they start to murder and dismember the wayward teens, we aren't cheering for the family. At least, not unless we're doing so ironically as part of a social activity where we all kind of make light of the story itself. But if we're watching in genuine earnest, we see that family as antagonistic, and we do not identify with their perspective. We don't identify with the cannibal family's need to abduct the kids and eat them. On the contrary, we identify with the victims, with the people who are opposed to the family. So we identify with a perspective which is still opposed to cannibalism, opposed to the taboo. The film is not constructed in a way where we indulge in the fantasy of cannibalism. On the contrary, it's constructed in a way where we are opposed to cannibalism as it's presented to us. So we get to have a movie with cannibalism in it, we get to have the taboo of cannibalism represented, and in that sense we can explore cannibalism, but at the same time, we don't have to violate our adult socialization by indulging in that exploration, or seeing the cannibalism as good. So in this way, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre allows us to deal with our adult taboos. It allows us to explore just what that taboo is, but not in a way that would change or violate our aversion to it. since after all, it still is a taboo for us. And again, it is important to establish that the Freudians are not saying this. They're not saying, oh, we all secretly deep down like cannibalism or want to be cannibals. No, that's wrong. If we're properly socialized adults, then cannibalism is a taboo for us. We don't secretly like it. We don't secretly enjoy it. What we have is a curiosity about the notion, perhaps as a result of trauma of learning what a taboo it is. But we have some kind of curiosity, but that curiosity can be satisfied in a way where we still maintain our adult socialized perspective of being averse to cannibalism. It's not that we're secretly enjoying the idea of cannibalism, we're just secretly kind of curious about it. And a monster that represents cannibalism allows us to satisfy that curiosity while staying who we are now, having been socialized. Or consider Ridley Scott's famous sci-fi horror film, Alien. In that film, by the screenwriter's own admission, the facehugger represents the taboo fear of sexual assault. The facehugger grabs one of the protagonists, forces a reproductive organ into them, and then holds them in such a way where if anyone tries to violently resist, the facehugger will destroy its host. And they just must sit there witnessing the result in horror until it finally does kill them and bring about an even bigger monster. Now, according to the Freudians, the facehugger represents something like forced sexual assault, which, if we're properly socialized, is a taboo, something that we should be horrified by and averse to. Yet, as a taboo, there's a curiosity about it, a curiosity brought on by the trauma brought on by even the vaguest acquaintance with the concept. Well, the movie does what the Texas Chainsaw Massacre did. It allows the audience to explore the taboo, but it does not present the facehugger's actions as being sympathetic or neat or cool in a way where you're cheering for it. Unless, of course, again, you're doing so ironically as part of some social act. But when appreciating the film as itself, we are exploring this taboo, but maintaining our adult socialized stance of revulsion and repugnance at it. It allows us to explore the taboo while remaining who we are. That's what a monster does, at least according to Freudians. In addition to taboos, Freudians also admit that sometimes a monster can represent a strong infantile fear. Take, for instance, the fear an infant has of being sick for the first time, having fever, not knowing what's wrong with it, feeling like there's something inside of it, tossing and turning in a tiny bed while a bunch of adults are standing around saying weird things, calling their name. Well, that's an Exorcist movie right there, isn't it? And there are plenty of movies exploring the taboos of incest, like Cat People, and I think even a production of Black Christmas, although I can't recommend that. And you can say that filthy monsters like the Blob in a way represent the taboo of touching excrement or having it touch you. So you can see how Freudians handle monsters in horror fiction. They solve the paradox of horror by saying that audiences do not seek horror fiction for its distinctive genre-defining characteristic. They don't. They don't seek horror fiction for the frightened disgust. They seek it for the opportunity to explore a taboo at a safe distance, to explore a taboo while not indulging in that taboo, to explore it while still at the same time saying, I'm an adult and I do not like these things myself. That's the Freudian approach. Now, it's worth mentioning, there's one kind of monster that Freudian analysis works rather well for in a funny way. If you consider the cultural taboos I've listed before, cannibalism, incest, contact with excrement, violent assault of the innocent or weak, things like that, well, there's one taboo that's kind of missing. Consider a wide cultural practice which starts out as taboo. For kids and for people below a certain age, it's absolutely taboo. It is as bad as any of these things. But then, as the kids grow up, it stops being a taboo and has to start, or is often presented as having to start, being part of their adult life. What's that? Sex, of course. Sex as a taboo. Now, Here's where the Freudian analysis does very well. If the Freudian analysis is correct about taboos and the role that they play in horror fiction, then, given the weird status sex has as taboo until you're a certain age, we would expect there to be a monster which represents sex, particularly popular among people coming of a sexual age, which represents that the taboo is bad, but not all bad. So that maybe there's a group of monsters, and they're all bad and evil, and they represent sex. But then there's the good monster that represents sex, and that one's different and better. And it's kind of romantic getting to know that good monster who stands out from the rest. You know what I'm describing? That's right, vampires. A vampire is a attractive, sexy monster, which it can be one of the bad vampires who just wants to use you and take you away, or it can be a good vampire which properly introduces the antagonist so that the world of vampires isn't a taboo anymore. And along with that just structural similarity, you have the fact that vampire feeding involves the exchange of fluids, nightly visits, a weird mental communication after the feeding is done, a heightened sense of perception of when the other person is there. It's a monster which practically screams, "I represent sexuality." And given the status of sexuality as a taboo in our culture, it makes sense that it's popular exactly amongst the demographics it's popular with. Young adults. Score one for the Freudians. Maybe. Of course, just as Freudians do rather well with vampires and some other examples, Texas Chainsaw Massacre for instance, doesn't mean that they do as well with all monster types. Some monster types seem to have themes or are based in ideas that have nothing to do with cultural taboos, and even less to do with any infantile fears. Take Michael Dougherty's wonderful film Krampus, with a Christmas-themed monster and some Christmas-themed monster minions. There are, of course, strong cultural feelings many have about Christmas, many strong cultural associations. In that sense, the symbolism is heavy, but taboo? Quite the opposite. In fact, everyone in our culture is encouraged to participate in Christmas. It's almost mandatory for some households in some areas of the country. Where is the taboo represented by this Christmas monster? It doesn't seem there is one. Likewise with infantile fears. It's true, Christmas is a vivid experience, and probably some children are traumatized by its sudden appearance every winter, but that could be true about so many things. It does not seem sufficiently unique to say that this is a cultural taboo or a particularly traumatizing experience for children. Or take the horror movie Midsummer. What cultural taboo is being represented here? The weird, insular, homicidal nature cult, I mean, they're monstrous enough, but what's the taboo they represent? What taboo do we have that they embody? It doesn't look like there's an obvious Freudian analysis for that one either. Pacific Rim wasn't really a horror movie, but it did have monsters, and we might ask, well, if those are monsters, Freudians, what do they represent? What's the taboo represented by the giant reptilian radioactive dinosaur thing? And likewise, Noel Carroll in The Reading brings up Godzilla. So, Freudians have a good analysis for some monsters in the way that they may represent taboos, but not for all monsters. So we might doubt whether they have a sufficiently comprehensive analysis for dealing with the paradoxes of horror. Before ending our discussion of the Freudian approach to the paradox of horror, I want to consider one straightforward philosophical objection which Carroll raises for the Freudians. We'll call it the Combinatorial Objection. And it goes like this. First, monsters can be generated infinitely through combinatorial means. Second, if monsters can be generated infinitely through combinatorial means, then the Freudian solution to the paradox of horror is false. 3. So the Freudian solution to the paradox of horror is false. Let's talk about how this objection works. First of all, you could make an infinite number of monsters just through combinatorial means. Take a thing, a deer. Now put some other thing on it, a lion's head. So we've made a deer with a lion's head. Cool, that's a monster. Now take that thing, a deer with a lion's head. Put something else on it, a bat wing. Now we've got a deer with a lion's head with a bat wing. Cool, that's a different monster. Now take another thing, a football. Put it on top of the deer with the bat wing and a lion head. Cool. Now we've got another monster. And so on and so on and so on. You can take monsters and combine them. You can take monsters and remove some of their parts and combine them with others. And you can do so infinitely, an infinite number. But it seems, according to Freudian analysis, every monster has to represent a taboo, right? Surely there cannot be infinitely many taboos, just as there are infinitely many monsters. It's so easy to come up with monsters, you could do it all day long forever and have infinitely many of them. Are there that many taboos? Such is the spirit behind the assumption 2. 2 is basically saying, look, if you can generate an infinite number of monsters, you should have an infinite number of taboos, which there aren't. So, concluding from the first 2 assumptions, we say the Freudian theory is false. Now, I bet you're thinking this already, but the Freudian is not exactly helpless against this objection. Really, in order to respond to it, the Freudian could do a couple of things. One thing the Freudian could do is to just say, well, more than one monster can represent the same taboo. Maybe you've got 600,000 weird-looking deer, but they all represent something about incest. Or maybe you've got 900 million different kind of sludge monsters, but they all represent excrement in some way or another. Right? The mere fact that there are infinitely numbered monsters doesn't mean that there have to be infinitely numbered taboos. In addition to this, though, the Freudian should distinguish between monster with a little m and monster with a big M. That is, there are the fictional creatures which are called monsters just because they don't exist in our world. You know, like centaurs can be monsters. Snuffleupagus is a monster. But then there are the monsters, which are monsters with a big M, and those are the ones that figure prominently in horror fiction, and do so because they represent taboos. Not every monster little m is a monster big M. And because Freudian's analysis discussed monsters with a big M, and because this combinatorial objection concerns monsters with a little m, the Freudian can kind of avoid the objection that way too. Anyway, that's our discussion of the Freudian solution to the paradox of horror. We're going to move on to the romantic solution championed by H.P. Lovecraft soon. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching.